hang-up call. A patrol officer with nearly 6 years on the job said the call started like many odd ones do, with a 911 hang-up in the small hours of a summer night. He and his partner were working 2-up around 2 or 3 in the morning when dispatch flagged a call where someone dialed, said nothing, and disconnected. Callbacks went unanswered. GPS put the origin near a spot he had driven past for years but never had a reason to visit, a short side road that never came up on his runs. Afterward, they rolled to a narrow dirt lane blocked by a chain and a no trespassing sign. Since they still needed to check the welfare of whoever dialed, they continued on foot. The road stretched about 100 yards, gravel underfoot, and tall chain link fences on both sides that turned the walk into a tight corridor. The officer thought about how exposed that made them, because if someone waited at the far end with a rifle, there would be nowhere to take cover. They kept going anyway, slow and deliberate, eyes working the dark. The lane opened onto 2 small houses facing each other. At first, they figured one of these was the source. A light flicked across a window and a shape moved, which surprised them because the place felt like it should have been empty. A man and a woman stepped out and asked what was going on. The officers explained the 911 hang-up and read back the number and the listed address, calling it 123 Main for the report. The man said his place was 124 Main, the one across the way was 125 Main and vacant, and that there was in fact a 123 tucked north of his house in a thicket of tall weeds and scrub. According to him, it was an old, rundown place only reachable on foot and set a couple of football fields into the brush. While they sorted all of that out, dispatch logged 2 more hang-ups from the same number. Before pushing into the woods, they asked for another car, and soon a second 2-officer unit arrived. The 4 of them took a faint path into the trees. 2 carried patrol rifles. The route was the kind that snaps at your face with spider webs and drags branches across your shoulders. Fast forward, they followed the track until it opened onto a structure that looked like it had been dropped straight from a horror set. One tree had fallen through the roof long ago and had grown into the wreckage. Walls leaned, vines clawed up the sliding, and every edge seemed soft with rot. They worked forward until they found a way in, and getting through meant stepping over collapsed brick and broken wood. The officer's biggest fear was that the place would fold in on itself and trap them where no one could hear them. Still, they cleared it room by room. They checked closets, crawl spaces, and every corner, and they left nothing unsearched. It was empty though. No signs of life, recent or otherwise. They climbed back out, pushed through the brush, and started toward the 2 houses by the lane. That was when dispatch came on the radio again. Another 911 hang-up from the same number had just hit the system. This time, the call taker reached the number on the callback and heard what sounded like a child playing on the other end. The 4 officers stood there looking at one another with the overgrown house at their backs and the woods in front of them. They had checked the structure completely. They had a tight path in and out and a long hike back to the cars. They had already taken the risks they could justify. They decided they were done with that scene for the night. They cleared the call and no more hang-ups came in before dawn. About 6 months later, the same number popped again, this time in deep winter when the brush had died back. The officer responded with 3 colleagues who had not been there the first time. He told them the story as they made their way down the lane, which was easier to navigate now that the green cover was gone. The 3 others wanted to see the place themselves. He stayed outside while they stepped through the entrance, took a quick look, and then changed their minds the moment they felt how soft the floors were underfoot. They backed out before the structure could make the decision for them. But yeah, they left the area the same way that they came, and no callback reached a child's voice that night. No more rings from the same line, just the cold and the sound of boots on gravel as they walked back to the chain across the entrance. Between the trees. A former paramedic who still pulls weekend EMT shifts said he always assumed that if anything strange ever happened on duty, it would be inside an ambulance, given how many lives passed through those doors. But the night that changed his mind unfolded on a lonely stretch of road instead. His service covered a small city and the surrounding towns, the kind of place with suburbs that taper into woods and a river valley. Near the outer edge of their coverage, they were sent to a call and then cancelled by first responders before arrival. It was 4:30 in the morning on a Wednesday in autumn, with the sky dark and the air quiet. The drive back toward town took about 20 minutes along a long, straight road with weak streetlights and dense forest pressing close on both sides. He rode in the passenger seat, face lit by the laptop as he finished the cancelled report, already thinking about clocking out after a long night. His partner slowed and asked if he could see what was ahead. He proceeded to close the laptop and squinted through the headlights. About 100 feet in front of them, a large dog moved away from the rig at a steady, unhurried pace. It looked silver gray with upright ears capped by little tufts, and its back came up so high that he guessed it stood close to 4 feet at the shoulder. They eased down to a crawl, thinking it might be injured and wearing a collar or tag that would lead them to an owner. With the ambulance rolling at 5 miles an hour, flashers ready, the plan was simple. He would call out, see if the animal tolerated people, and help if it needed it. The dog was on his side of the road, and so were they, and the distance shrank from 100 feet to now about something like 30. When they reached roughly 10 yards out, a feeling hit both of them at once. It was that sudden drop in the gut that tells you something is wrong before you can even explain why, a cold wave that made him aware of how exposed he was. The animal rose. From his angle, he saw it lift without using its front legs to brace, and the width across the shoulders did not match anything he had seen on a normal canine. His partner had stopped the truck. The figure tilted its head a fraction to the left, just enough to catch a slight glint of yellow from one eye in the beam, then turned toward the woods on the passenger side and ran. It cleared the guardrail and tore through the brush with a kind of clean, precise movement that looked practiced rather than panicked, and in a blink it was gone. What stayed with him was that moment right before it had stood. The sense of dread arrived first, as if a message reached him without words, telling him that he meant well, that he should move on, and that there was nothing to see. He had watched plenty of dogs rear up on their hind legs for a second or two. He had never watched something that size though rise, hold itself, and then sprint away on 2 legs with that kind of control. Later, after trying to make sense of it, he read about reports tied to the Michigan Dogman and the Beast of Bray Road, which sounded familiar in shape and movement, except those stories come from the Midwest and he lives in southern New England, a place not exactly known for Bigfoot talk or local cryptid lore. But yeah, he could not say what he believed after that night, and he was certain he did not believe in movie monsters, yet the memory remained clear. He saw something that looked very much like a werewolf once on a dark road between the trees, and it looked back before it had disappeared. A daughter's warning. It was the second year of an EMT's career, still filled with the excitement and idealism of a job that promised to make a real difference. The squad was solid, working in a city where calls came in regularly, some routine and others more serious. But there are moments, even in the middle of a standard shift, that stick with you, changing everything that you believe in. On a cold January evening, the crew received a typical call. A homeless man had been found sleeping on a bench and was given the choice of either spending the night in a cell or heading to the hospital. It was a situation they had encountered countless times before, with the man being a familiar face on the streets, known for his occasional drunken tirades. He wasn't a stranger to the officers or to the EMTs. He had earned his reputation as the local bag lady of sorts, always wandering around, finding somewhere to sleep, only to be moved on once again. When the EMTs arrived on scene, it was business as usual. The man was lying on a private bench, murmuring about the system and the cops who would always tell him to move along. He was drunk as expected and unwilling to make things easy for the officers. But when the offer of a warm bed at the hospital was given, he agreed without much resistance. The crew proceeded to help him into the ambulance, with the drunken man struggling to stay upright as they started their journey to the local ER. During the ride, as the man sat there half asleep, the EMTs continued their usual assessment. The man was mumbling softly, with his words barely coherent. The EMT, more focused on the paperwork than on trying to get more details from the patient, continued with routine tasks. But then something strange happened. From the bench seat next to the EMT, a voice clearly spoke, oddly loud and unmistakably female. It wasn't the voice of any of the crew or anyone present. It was a woman's voice, sharp but not angry, and with a tone of gentle disapproval. The words that followed were clear and firm. Patient name, stop drinking. The sudden outburst made the man jump, and in an instant he sat upright, tears beginning to form in his eyes. He apologized repeatedly, saying he was sorry and that he would stop drinking. In between sobs, he said he loved and missed her, and that she had asked him to thank the EMT. It was definitely an odd moment, one that seemed to come out of nowhere, leaving the EMT uncertain of what had just happened. But the man's reaction was undeniable. When they arrived at the ER, the man was immediately recognized by the doctor, who had treated him many times before. The first thing the man said was that he wanted information on Alcoholics Anonymous, as if a sudden clarity had washed over him. He was no longer the drunken, irate figure from earlier. The doctor, understanding immediately, spoke with sympathy, mentioning how sorry he was for the patient's loss. What he meant was the patient's daughter had been a nurse at that very same hospital, and just 1 year ago to the very day, she had died in a car accident hit by a drunk driver. It was a moment that left the crew completely shaken up. The daughter had actually been that very EMT's first code, dead on arrival. The patient, now visibly emotional, had just experienced what seemed like an impossible connection. The voice in the ambulance, the message that seemed to come from nowhere, was a piece of a much larger story, a reminder of loss, of love, and of the strange ways the dead seemed to reach out. That night, the EMT began to believe, not in the typical ghost stories or folklore, but in a presence that could not be explained away. The connection between the patient and his deceased daughter was too real, too vivid to be dismissed as coincidence. One last detour. In the course of his career, one police officer developed a special skill for diffusing tense and violent situations. He had an ability to talk down even the most emotionally disturbed individuals, a talent that became invaluable in his line of work. Among the people he dealt with regularly was a woman named Annie, who had earned a reputation in the area. Annie was known for her frequent run-ins with the law, including shoplifting and disturbing the peace. On occasion, depending on her mood, she would resist arrest and struggle with officers. No one ever wanted to hurt her though, so taking her into custody could sometimes be more of a challenge than anticipated. Annie wasn't known for her hygiene and she rarely bathed, but she would always cover up the smell with copious amounts of Stetson aftershave. The heavy scent would fill the air and could make your eyes water. It lingered in the car for hours after transporting her, leaving behind a sharp, cloying reminder of her presence. The officer, however, had developed a routine for handling these situations. The first time he arrested Annie, he approached her with a calm demeanor and used a gentle, almost theatrical voice, what he called his Fraser Cain voice. Remarkably, it worked. He was able to get her into custody without much of a fight, which was not always the case with her. During the ride to jail, the officer asked if Annie had eaten. When she replied that she hadn't, he made a rare detour to buy her a 2-piece chicken meal with a biscuit. He then drove slowly to the jail so she could enjoy her meal in peace. This small act of kindness became a pattern. Whenever Annie found herself in trouble again, she would specifically request this officer to take her to jail, knowing that he would treat her with a bit more care than the others. As the officer moved up the ranks and was eventually promoted to sergeant, he was assigned a marked cruiser number 61. It was parked in the motor pool lot waiting to be reissued. As a supervisor now, he was given an unmarked car. Later that day, he responded to a fatal accident. The incident involved a truck and the victim turned out to be Annie. She had been run over and killed. The news hit him hard. He had always taken on the unofficial role of a protector, and now, despite all the care he had shown her, she was gone. It was a blow he hadn't expected, and he couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, he had failed her. That night, something disturbing happened. A deputy from the sheriff's office called in, reporting that someone was hiding in one of the department's cruisers parked in the back lot. The officer was heading in to complete some paperwork and got to the lot first. The deputy mentioned that it was cruiser number 61. He made his way to the car, expecting to find someone inside, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. Still, the officer had to check for any potential damage, so another officer brought a key to unlock it. When the door opened, the first thing that hit him was the unmistakable smell of Stetson aftershave, the same scent that Annie had always worn. The officer stood still for a moment, the familiar scent filling the air, and a chill ran down his spine. It felt as though Annie had left behind some kind of presence in the car, as though she was still there, lingering in the air long after her death. The smell was a stark reminder of the bond they had shared, and the officer couldn't help but wonder if her spirit was reaching out to him from beyond the grave. It was an experience he would never forget, one that added a layer of mystery to an already strange chapter in his life. The open line. A former EMT and firefighter told a story that began with a simple wellness check late one night after a 911 call where the caller said nothing and the line stayed open. The crew proceeded to drive out and ended up finding a small, well-kept house that looked quiet from the street, the kind of place where the porch light throws a steady circle and everything appears in order. An older woman opened the door as soon as they reached the steps. She was calm and polite, and when they asked if she knew who had called, she said she lived alone because her husband had passed away. With no signs of trouble and nothing else to go on, they cleared the scene and headed back to the station. They had barely settled in before dispatch sent the same address again. Same type of call, same open line with no response, same quiet house in the system. They turned around, drove back, and spoke with the woman once more. She repeated that she had lived alone and had not called. Everything they could see from the doorway looked normal, and there was no reason to press further. They left a second time and started back. The third call came in almost as soon as they rolled in. Same address, same silent line. By then, the repetition felt like a pattern that should not exist, so they went out again. This time, no one met them outside. The front door was unlocked, but there was no answer to their knocks and calls. So they stepped inside and found the woman on the floor, not breathing. Training took over. They worked quickly, moved her to the ambulance, and managed to stabilize her. When she came to the rig, she insisted she had never called 911 and said they had arrived almost immediately after she fell, even though the station was a 15-minute drive from her street. Before she was admitted at the hospital, she asked the EMT and another crew member for a favor. She wanted her knitting needles and a bag of clothes brought to her room. He agreed to help and said it would be easy because he planned to see a friend who lived nearby. Later, he picked up that friend and drove back to the house. He left the car running, went inside, and grabbed exactly what she had requested. As he turned to leave, he felt a light hand on his back and heard a man's voice say a simple thank you. The sound was close, like a quiet word just over his shoulder. Back in the car, his friend looked off edge and asked why the woman's husband could not bring the bag to the hospital. The EMT explained that her husband had died, which only made his friend stare harder at the front window. The friend said he had just seen an older man there, smiling and giving a small wave as if he were grateful someone was helping. The EMT did not want to assume anything beyond what he could confirm, so he called the police and asked for a sweep of the house. Officers went room to room and found nothing out of place and no one inside. Later, he brought his friend to visit the woman at the hospital. They stood by the bed and made small talk until his friend began describing the man he had seen in the window, the age, the friendly look, the wave. The woman's eyes filled almost at once. She stopped him gently and said that was her herald. She still said she lived alone though. She still said she had not called. She simply recognized the description and spoke her husband's name with the certainty of someone who knows a face by heart. The missing trail. An EMT described a call that came in for a cyclist who had been riding at a breakneck pace and struck a car head first with no helmet. The crew proceeded to drive out and ended up finding a quiet suburban street in full daylight on a Saturday. Yet no one was around and no one had stepped forward to help. It felt strange from the start because scenes like this usually draw a crowd, but the road was empty and still. They reached the rider and saw at once how severe it was. He was unresponsive and blood was flowing fast. The quick assessment pointed to a major skull fracture and a concussion, with teeth missing and a scrape along the road that counted as a minor rash, and oddly, he was not missing much skin despite the impact. Under normal circumstances, they would have moved him off the pavement, but with the possible head and neck injury, that choice is not safe, so they prepared gear where he lay and worked methodically. The EMT's partner, who was also training him, crouched to check for a pulse while the newer EMT began unloading equipment. The partner felt for a long moment at the neck and readied himself to say something that sounded final. But before he could speak, the rider suddenly sprang to his feet in one smooth motion without using his arms to push off. Both responders jumped back in shock. The man looked at them, gave a casual smile, and reached for his bicycle as if he were about to continue his ride. They tried to block him though without forcing a struggle, since any grappling could make a neck injury worse. He slipped past regardless, left the bike where it stood, and sprinted toward the tree line. The partner stared at the spot where the man disappeared between the trunks, then turned and said in a flat, shaken voice that the rider had no pulse. The newer EMT asked if he was certain, and the partner insisted he was, repeating that by every measure, the man had been clinically gone. They called it in and requested help, and a search and rescue team moved into the woods to look for the cyclist. The EMT did not hear what came of the search though, since handoffs to other teams usually mean there's little feedback after the fact. His own guess was that the rider might have run to a familiar house in confusion, which sometimes happens with head injuries. What kept bothering him, though, was how little sense the trail made. Injuries like the one he saw bleed heavily, which should have left an obvious path to follow, yet the street and the edge of the woods did not show the kind of clear red line he expected to see. The woman with curly hair. A user writing from Pennsylvania described an evening a few months back when their dad, an EMT, needed to stop by the station to check his schedule. The user and an older sibling rode along and waited in the vehicle while he went inside. The lot was quiet, the radio low, and across the glass the downstairs office sat dark, with a smaller room behind it also unlit. Conversation drifted, but the user kept glancing toward that shadowed doorway, curious without knowing why. The chat tapered off. The sibling slid on headphones while the user let the radio fill the silence, looked across the parking area, then back to the office window. Something in the tiny back room caught the eye. A woman with light curly hair sat in a chair with her body turned slightly away. One hand moved like she was dialing, then lifted what looked like a phone to her ear. The user asked what someone would be doing back there in the dark. The sibling followed the point, peered in, and agreed it looked like a person on a phone. With no lights on and only that repeated motion, they went back to waiting. A few minutes later, their dad returned, buckled in, and reached to pull out. The user checked the office again. The same woman now stood at the front desk, head down over papers, and then in the next glance, she was gone. The user asked why anyone would be working without the lights. Their dad frowned and said no one was downstairs. The crew was out, and the only woman on duty had dark hair and had been upstairs the whole time with him. The user looked to the sibling for a reality check. The sibling nodded. They had both seen the same figure, and their dad added that people often mentioned feeling watched in that building, a line he had heard enough times not to make a big deal of it. When the user shared the story later, others echoed familiar details from quiet stations, like footsteps in nearby halls and brief glimpses that did not match anyone on the roster. The moment itself stayed simple: two siblings in a parked vehicle while their dad checked the schedule upstairs. In a dark office below, a woman with light curly hair working an invisible phone in the back room, then standing at the front desk beneath a dead ceiling light and then gone, leaving two witnesses and a question their dad could not answer. Accident and white mist. A user writing from North Carolina described being around 14 or 15 riding with their mom to an evening youth group at church when the quiet at a stoplight snapped under the loudest tire screech they had ever heard. Both turned left in time to see a car launch off a V-shaped median, lift into the air, and slam into a telephone pole and a utility box. The sound carried across the intersection, and then everything felt too still. Training from 2 summers as a lifeguard kicked in. The door opened, feet hit the pavement, and the user ran, with a plan that was simple and careful enough to matter until help arrived. Mom pulled the car into the grass and chased after, calling out while closing the distance. At the wreck, the driver looked to be a man in his mid-30s. He was unconscious but breathing, and the breathing sounded heavy and uneven. Both ankles looked badly injured. The engine was still running, so the user reached in and turned it off, then resisted the instinct to pull him clear, knowing a spinal injury couldn't be ruled out. There was no fire and no traffic pressing into the scene, so the safest choice was to leave him in place, watch the airway, and wait for EMS. Sirens would be on the way. Mom reached the car and stayed on the other side of the door with a steady hand on his arm, while the user held his hand and focused on keeping him as calm as a person could be while unconscious. They began to pray for him softly, not because it would replace care, but because it was something to do in the space before professionals arrived. The moment that followed stayed with the user long after. Eyes opened during the prayer and landed on the man's face. From the skin above his features, a white, milky mist seemed to rise, smooth and steady, as if being pulled upward rather than drifting like smoke. It was not the gray haze of a cigarette or the dark edge of engine exhaust. It looked clean, almost luminous, and it moved straight up toward the night sky. The user asked if Mom could see it. Mom said no. The user kept watching, trying to find a source that made ordinary sense, but there wasn't one. The man continued to breathe, the sound still labored, the ankles still wrong, the dashboard quiet now that the engine was off, and the white mist kept drawing upward until it thinned into air. They stayed with him until the wail of approaching units grew loud enough to fill the intersection again. There was no attempt at moving him or at starting compressions because he was breathing on his own. The plan was to hold hands, keep talking even if he could not hear, and hand off cleanly. Lights washed across the pavement, crews stepped in with practiced speed, and the user and Mom backed away to give space, their hands empty again and shaking a little now that there was nothing left to do. The rest of the night unfolded on the calendar the way it was supposed to. The users still went to the youth group meeting, arrived late, sat through it, and heard almost none of it. The crash replayed in the mind, the way the car had gone airborne, the hard stop against the pole, the sound of breathing that wasn't quite right, and the pure white lift from his face that no one else seemed to notice. The next day, they tried to find out who he was. Calls to the hospital didn't give any answers though. Privacy rules and the patchwork of information made it hard for bystanders to learn anything concrete, so the user made peace with not knowing for sure. Deep down though, there was a sense that he had made it. It wasn't logic so much as the same feeling that had pushed a teenager across an intersection to turn off an engine, hold a hand, and wait for help. That same feeling said he survived. Whether that was right or not, the image of the mist never left. Paramedic, creepy DOA. A Connecticut paramedic working the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. overnight took a cardiac arrest call at an apartment building and breached the entrance with fire EMTs and 2 officers. A man sat in a patio chair by the front door, smoking in a white tank top, eyes distant like he had just been shaken from sleep. He called out that he remembered the medic and asked if the person upstairs was alright. The tone felt off, more hollow than worried, but there wasn't time to stand there and sort it out, so the medic headed in. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. In a small bedroom at the end of a short hall, the same man was on the floor at the foot of a twin mattress that sat directly on the boards. His body was folded low on his knees as if he had been sitting on the mattress and slid forward. Rigor and lividity were present. Blood had pooled near his feet and there was a single wound at the back of the head. Nothing on the walls or ceiling suggested an overhead strike. The room was tight, the scene consistent with the collapse where he had landed. The medic confirmed death and handed the DOA to the officer. Back at the entrance, the chair was empty. The neighbor who had found the body hadn't seen anyone sitting there, and neither had fire or police. No one knew of a twin or a relative who matched him either. The man who spoke at the door could not be accounted for by anyone else on that scene. The details stuck because they were simple and lined up. A narrow hallway into a cramped room, a mattress on the floor, a body position that made sense for a short fall forward, and injuries that fit what gravity would do. The only part that refused to fit was the meeting at the door. The man spoke like he knew the medic and already understood who was upstairs, then appeared in the bedroom as the deceased and was gone again from the chair before anyone else could say they had seen him at all. Haunted fire station. A veteran EMS worker from Georgia said that 2 stations made up most of the rotation, and the one that also housed the fire rigs carried a weight the other never did. Quiet hours brought it out. While restocking alone in the bays, footsteps crossed the concrete where no one else was signed in, and doors settled shut with the soft, decisive sound that usually follows a hand. The sense of a presence never shouted, it pressed in at the edges and lingered after the noise stopped. Upstairs in the lounge, late at night when everyone had turned in, attention kept drifting to the stairwell door. It felt like someone stood just beyond it, waiting for a glance. Sleep did not always help either. On one of those nights, as the bunk finally pulled the eyelids down, the body seemed to loosen and lift. The ceiling rushed close until it looked only inches away, the viewpoint wrong enough to jolt the mind awake before dropping back into place. It was not a dream that fades on contact either, it stayed sharp and specific the next morning. The same pattern ran for nearly 4 weeks. Odd sounds in the bays that fixed awareness at the stairwell, small shifts of air that didn't match the building's hum. Then an older man stopped in one evening to talk with the crew and sit for a while. After he left, someone mentioned he was the father of a firefighter who had died in the line of duty the year before. The detail clicked. The sleeping room in use had once been shared by that firefighter. The presence began to feel less like a threat and more like someone trying to be noticed in familiar rooms. From then on, the after-hours activity made a different kind of sense. Low, muffled voices passed in the corridor when the roster showed everyone down, and thin shadows drifted across the strip of light under the door. There was no shove or slam meant to scare, just the steady nudge that says a place is still occupied. Fear rose anyway, as it does when the body recognizes something before the mind agrees. Calls still came, tones still dropped, and rigs still rolled, but the station's in-between moments, wiping down the stretcher alone, walking past the stairwell, clicking off the bunk room light, felt like a second assignment. The worker did not claim answers, only a run of nights that left no doubt that someone who belonged there had found a way to stay, and that the living were sharing space with more than their own crew. Haunted ambulance. In a rural part of Illinois, the local EMT department operates on a semi-volunteer basis with a designated system that assigns each ambulance a number followed by an A to indicate its role. For example, 5A1, 5A2, 5A3, depending on the specific vehicle. The crew often works in shifts, but there are days when no one is scheduled, leaving the station unmanned. One day, when the station was unstaffed, an eerie incident occurred that still haunts the EMT who witnessed it. A call went out requiring the help of both the EMT department and the fire department. Dispatch issued the alert, and the radio crackled as the unmistakable voice of a female responder came through, 5A2 en route. The fire department, already on scene, waited for the ambulance, but after 20 minutes, there was no sign of the EMT crew. They attempted to reach the ambulance over the radio, but there was no response. Concerned, one of the EMTs who lived nearby went to the station to check on the situation. Given that no one was scheduled to work that day, he figured it was worth confirming that everything was in order. When he arrived at the station, he found all 4 ambulances parked exactly where they were supposed to be, but there was no sign of anyone actually inside. After reviewing the security footage and checking the recorded radio transmissions, he discovered that during the time of the call, no one had been at the station. There was no sign of anyone using a radio, no mix-up with other departments, and no evidence of any unusual activity, yet someone had clearly answered the call over the radio. To add to the mystery, the voice that had responded didn't belong to anyone in the department. The staff had worked together long enough that they knew each other's voices over the radio, and no one recognized the female voice that had answered. Furthermore, there had been no new hires or members in the department who could have been the source of that voice. It was as if someone or something had responded from an unknown source with no physical presence to match it. For those who work at the station, incidents like this were disturbing, but they weren't completely unheard of. The department had experienced odd occurrences in the past, and some of the staff were convinced that something paranormal was at work. Others, however, suggested it could be some kind of technological glitch, though it didn't explain the unrecognized voice or the lack of any physical presence at the station when it should have been occupied. The EMT who witnessed the strange event was left wondering whether it was simply an overreaction to something explainable, or whether, as he began to suspect, the radio call had been answered by something other than a living person. The unanswered questions lingered in the back of his mind, and with his department's history of unusual occurrences, he couldn't help but wonder if this was yet another chapter in a series of disturbing experiences that still had no clear explanation. The Old Hospital. For nearly 19 years, an EMT worked for various ambulance agencies, including one hospital-based provider in New Jersey. This particular hospital was small and rural, struggling financially like many others in the area. Eventually, it was brought out by a larger corporation which began gradually closing down the hospital's services. The medical floors were shut first, and the emergency room, once open 24/7, was reduced to limited hours before being closed completely. Despite the changes, the ambulance station remained operational, though the hospital was mostly empty, save for the EMS crew and the occasional security guard. The EMT didn't work at this station full-time, but occasionally worked shifts there. The building, though now devoid of people, still held everything from the rooms to the offices. It was an eerie feeling to walk through a place once bustling with life, now silent and dormant. On one particular morning, around 4:45 a.m., the EMT arrived early, set to relieve the crew at 5 a.m. With time to spare, they decided to explore the hospital, curious about what remained in the vacant building. The silence of the hallways felt unnatural, as though the building still carried the remnants of its once vibrant past. The EMT visited areas like the old chapel and the ICU, but soon made their way back to the EMS office, remembering the job that awaited. As they walked back down the hallway, something strange began to happen. Whispering voices could be heard, clear and unmistakable. At first, the EMT couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from, but as they neared the waiting room, the whispers grew louder. Thinking it might be the lone security guard sitting quietly on the phone, the EMT entered the waiting room, only to find it completely empty. The whispering stopped as soon as they stepped inside. Freaked out, they punched in and went about their shift, though the unease of what had just occurred lingered in their minds. Days later, the EMT found themselves back at the same station, this time working with a colleague who had never been there before. Like the EMT, the new partner was curious about the hospital and the eerie feeling that it gave off. As they walked together through the dark hallways, the EMT shared the experience of the strange whispers. No sooner had they started discussing it than the colleague stopped and asked if they had heard anything. The silence in the hallway revealed what they were both hearing, whispering voices, once again clear but unintelligible. This time, they traced the sound to an old office just outside the waiting room. As they entered, the whispering ceased and the office stood silent, save for an empty desk. The moment confirmed for both of them what had seemed unbelievable just days earlier. The EMT wasn't imagining things. They weren't the only ones who had heard the voices, and not long after this experience, the building was sold and the ambulance station was relocated. The hospital building still stands to this day, vacant and awaiting redevelopment. Despite the passage of time though, it remains largely untouched, a quiet reminder of the strange occurrences that once haunted its empty hallways. When the EMT last drove by the building, it remained eerily still, a place frozen in time, holding its secrets within. The parked ambulance. It was around 2:45 a.m., halfway through a long and slow night shift. These hours were always quiet, and the calls didn't usually start coming in until later in the morning, around 6 or 7. The slow pace was typical at this time of night. Most of the calls would be routine, like when Mrs. Smith finds her husband cold and unresponsive when she tries to wake him up, leading to a 911 call. The ambulance was parked in the lot of a department store, and the only sound was the low hum of the diesel engine. Small puddles of water remained from the earlier rainfall, but most of the pavement had dried. The breeze stirred the water slightly, creating small ripples and breaking the stillness of the night. The streetlights reflected off the puddles, giving the whole scene a calm, eerie quality. Inside the rig, the two EMTs sat in their seats trying to get comfortable, though the design of the truck made that nearly impossible. The soft glow from the dashboard illuminated the space as they sat in silence, waiting for something to happen, something to break the quiet. It was a rare moment of peace, and they were trying to take advantage of it, knowing that the calls would eventually pick up. Suddenly, the temperature inside the rig shifted. It wasn't an extreme change, but it was noticeable, a wave of warmth that seemed to come from nowhere. The EMT sitting in the passenger seat felt it first, almost as if the air around him was different. And then the smell hit. It was sudden, strong, and unlike anything he had ever smelled before. It wasn't the usual odor that came with being in a confined space with equipment and the usual smells of the job. This was different, rancid, like something rotting, and it filled the entire ambulance. "What the hell, man?" one of the EMTs said, immediately covering his nose with his arm. "What did you eat before you came in tonight, you bastard?" The other EMT looked up, confused. "Huh? I didn't do anything. That wasn't me." "Well, it wasn't me either," the first EMT shot back, his voice laced with irritation. He later grabbed his jacket and buried his face in it, trying to block out the smell. "I didn't do anything," his partner insisted, but he couldn't avoid the discomfort either. He shifted in his seat, looking at the console, trying to ignore the smell that seemed to be filling the air. "It's not me." The first EMT paused, with his frustration giving way to something else. "Must have been a ghost," he muttered, half jokingly, but not entirely. The air gradually returned to normal and the smell dissipated, but the odd feeling lingered. It was one of those moments that couldn't be explained away, something that didn't quite make sense, but also couldn't be ignored. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but the disturbing memory of that moment stuck with both of them, lingering far longer than it should have.